All right, so we're moving on to the math section. And if you're like me, this is your favorite section of the test because who doesn't love math? But before we get into all the fun and games of doing actual problems, we really need to focus in on a couple of important definitions because apparently you think you know what certain math definitions are, but you don't. And when you get to the math question, if you happen to forget what a certain definition is, you're going to be totally screwed on that question because you're going to end up with the wrong answer. So let's go through all of the common words that you're going to find on the math section and make sure that you're totally sure what every one of those words means. So the first thing that is a big trigger word on the math section is if you see the word different or distinct in relation to numbers. So if a question is asking you for how many distinct numbers or how many different numbers there are that satisfy a certain equation, if all of a sudden you get the answer 3, 4, 4, and 5, and then you pick the answer 4, saying that there's 4 numbers that satisfy that equation, you're automatically going to get that question wrong because there aren't 4 distinct numbers, there's only 3 distinct numbers. We have a 3, we have a 4, and we have a 5. Even though 4 came up twice, it's not different. So that's a really important word, so whenever you see it in a question, really pay attention to it because you could end up getting a question wrong just by overlooking that one single word. The next word that you're going to want to pay close attention to is when you see least or greatest. So a lot of times you'll spend a lot of time solving a question and there could be more than one possible answer. But if a question asks you specifically for the least possible or the greatest possible number, then you will get that question wrong if you just put any of the numbers that make it work. So it's really important that you make sure that the correct answer that you're putting down is the least possible answer or the greatest possible if that's what the question wants. Another good trick is if you're testing out answer choices, which is a technique that we'll get to in the algebra section. If the question asks you for the least amount or the greatest, you're going to want to start with either the least number in the answer choices or the greatest number, since that's where you want to focus your energies. Moving on to our next definition, it's maximum and minimum. This is exactly the same as least and greatest, so just pay attention to any of those words that you see in a question. Then you have classic words like sum and product. Sum, you just want to remember, is when you add all of the things together. Product is when you multiply them. The next set is accept or not. Now, you might not think of these as mathematical terms, and they're not. However, they come up all the time on the math section, and a question will ask you for which one of the following is not correct. And they really know how students' minds work. And they are throwing you a bone by bolding that or capitalizing that or doing both. And every time a student gets that wrong, it just boggles my mind that they miss the capitalization or they miss the bolding. So they're really trying to tell you, like, you're going to screw up and you're going to make a careless mistake on this by forgetting to look at the word not. So don't be that guy. Pay attention to when they ask for it. And when you're solving those questions, you'll solve for the thing that works, but make sure that the answer that you pick is the thing that doesn't work, that is not true, or the thing that works with except. The next 2 words that you want to pay close attention to are must be true and could be true. These come up a lot in the math section. And there's 2 totally separate techniques for solving these type of questions. If a question is asking you for something that must be true, you can pick any number out there and the equation that they give you has to work because it must be true. So if you pick a random number and that equation doesn't work, then that equation is wrong. So must be true, you can pick whatever number you want and just test it out. A could be true question is something where you don't want to pick out a random number, because if something could be true, there's probably only one or two numbers that would make that equation work. So the likelihood of you picking the exact number that is going to make that question work is totally slim to none. So don't waste your time just trying to pick out random numbers. Work that equation out the way it should be, and you'll get the number that could work in it. Then, in terms of actual definitions, integer is probably the most important math term that you'll find on the SAT. And it's so common that people actually just forget what it means. An integer is a whole number. None of you guys know this. I don't know why, but everyone forgets that integers can be negative, so you can have negative integers, you can have positive integers, and 0 is an integer. So a lot of times they'll say, how many integers are there in this set? And everyone forgets that 0 is an integer, so don't be that guy. Make sure you remember that all whole numbers, whether they're positive, negative, or 0, are included in the group of all integers. Then we move on to rational number. Rational number is definitely a lot less frequently used, but you will see it. And a rational number is just any number that can be expressed as a fraction. So if it's a fraction or a whole number, it has to be rational. What is an irrational number is a repeating decimal that just keeps repeating over and over and over again, and you can't express it as a fraction. Then we get to the concept of consecutive numbers or consecutive integers. The word consecutive means following one after the other. So 1, 2, 3, 4, those are all consecutive integers. -10, -9, -8 are also consecutive integers. If the question asks you for what consecutive integers work, the way you can refer to it if you don't know what the actual integers are is if x is your first integer, the next integer, if we're being consecutive, can be referred to as x plus 1. The next integer after that would be x plus 2, and so on. So we're just adding 1 to each term here. What a lot of students do, as I've seen before, is they'll do x, 2x, and 3x. But that's not consecutive. That's doubling and then tripling. So that is going way too big, way too fast. So consecutive is just adding 1 each time. Then a question could also ask you for consecutive even integers or consecutive odd integers. So if we have consecutive even integers and we make x our first integer, and we say x is 2. The next even integer after 2 is 4. So to get from 2 to 4, we had to add 2. So in terms of x, that would be x plus 2. Then the next consecutive even integer is x plus 4. Same thing for an odd integer. If we made x our first integer, and x was 3 per se. The next odd integer up from 3 is 5. And to get to 5 from 3, we would just add 2. So if a question is asking you about consecutive even or consecutive odd integers, you need to refer to it as x, x plus 2, x plus 4, and so on. Then we move on to the square of something versus the square root. So I know you guys know what a square root is. It looks like this, and it really just means that it's asking you what number times itself equals the number under the symbol. So we know that 2 times itself is going to equal 4. So that is the square root. And you have a handy square root number or function on your calculator. The square of something is when you multiply the number by itself. So if it says the square of x, that's just a fancy way of saying x squared. So don't let that confuse you. When it says the square of, it's the same way of saying something squared. Then moving right along, we have prime numbers. And you probably haven't thought about prime numbers since middle school. And prime numbers just refer to any number that is only divisible by 1 and itself. So for example, the number 11. 11 is prime because we can't divide it by anything except 1 and 11. One important thing to remember is that 1 is not a prime number. Please do not forget that. Please just make an index card, put it in your study packet, and remember it, because if you think of 1 as a prime number, you could get a ton of the questions on the SAT wrong. So 1 is not prime. Then another concept that you want to remember is a factor versus a prime factor. So the factors of a number are just all of the other numbers that multiply to give us that number. So for example, if we have the number 24 and we want to think of all of the numbers that multiply to give us 24, we have 1 and 24. Then we have 2 and we have 12. We have 3 and 8. And we have 4 and 6. So all of those are the factors of 24. Now, if the question asks you for the prime factors of 24, all that's referring to are the factors that happen to be prime numbers. So looking at this group of factors, the only numbers in there that happen to be prime are 2 and 3. So the prime factors of 24 are just 2 and 3. So don't forget about that. And then one of the last couple of definitions that you need to know is the reciprocal. So the reciprocal just means the flip of something. So if we want to get the reciprocal of 4 over 5, it would be 5 over 4. So whenever you have a number, you're just going to flip it. The reciprocal of something that's a whole number, like 3, you want to think of 3 as actually 3 over 1. So the reciprocal of that would be 1 over 3. Then the last two definitions are constant and variable. A constant is just a fancy way of referring to a number. It's a single number and it stays constant. A variable, as the word implies, varies. So it can be many different numbers. So when you see the word constant, it's just a fancy way of saying it's a number. So if they say D is a constant, that just means D is a specific number and it can only be 1. If they say X is the variable, it means that X can change and it could be a lot of different numbers. So those are just important terms to remember. Then we're going to move on into a couple of things you need to remember about calculations.